start recording. Yes. So welcome to this web roundtable with distinguished guests, Dr. Charlotte Heath Kelly, and other four also very special guests, Professor Christian Kaunert, Professor Sarah Leonard, Professor Christopher Weller, and Dr. James Fitzgerald. I will introduce our guest speaker and the other speakers, and we will try to follow a traditional roundtable. I will allow attendees to interact and ask questions. I would just ask you to raise your hands, and whenever you want, when they all finish, you will be able to raise your hands and turn on your cameras and mics and ask your questions to make it more interactive. I will just read now short bios of our guest speakers. I will introduce myself, of course, in the end. So Dr. Charlotte Heath Kelly is a reader in international security at the University of Warwick. She presently leads ERC-funded project entitled Neoliberal Terror, the Radicalisation of Social Policy in Europe. Her interest in how security policy imagines the future is a dominant feature of her current work, appearing in articles including Security Dialogue and the British Journal of Politics and International Relations. She has previously published 2 books on the intersection of memory and terrorism, one for Routledge, Politics of Violence, and the second one, Death and Security, Memory and Mortality at the Bomb Site with Manchester University Press. Professor Christian Kaunert is our beloved director of the Jean Monnet Network on EU Counter-Terrorism. He's currently the director of Terrorism and Security and the leader of the Cognate Research Group on Policing and Security at the International Centre for Policing and Security at the University of South Wales. And he holds a Jean Monnet Chair in Policing and Counter-Terrorism in Europe. Previously, he served as an academic director and professor at the Institute of European Studies at the University of Brussels. He's a professor of international politics, head of discipline in politics, and the director and was a director of the European Institute for Security and Justice, Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence at the University of Dundee. Professor Sarah Leonard is currently a professor of international security at the University of the West of England in Bristol, and she was previously associate professor in international affairs at Vesalius College, which was an affiliated of the University in Brussels. She's a visiting professor at the University of South Wales and a research collaborator with Professor Christian Kaunert. Previously to her post at UWE in Bristol, Sarah was a lecturer in international security at the University of Salford, a Marie Curie Research Fellow at Sciences Po, a senior lecturer in politics at University of Dundee, and associate professor in international affairs at Vesalius College in Brussels as well. Her research interests lie at the intersection between security studies and European studies. She is particularly interested in the securitization processes and development of European Union internal security policies, especially those relating to asylum, migration, and borders, as well as counter-terrorism. Professor Christopher Weller is currently a professor and chair at Political Science, Peace and Conflict Studies at Augsburg University and was previously University Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies at Philipps University Marburg in Germany. He is also a visiting professor at University of South Wales and a research collaborator with Professor Christian Kaunert at University of South Wales. He has a significant research experience in peace and conflict studies, as well as in international relations theory and foreign policy studies. Finally, Dr. James Fitzgerald is assistant professor in terrorism studies at the School of Law and Government and program director of the Erasmus Mundus International Masters in Intelligence and Strategic Studies at DCU. He was previously co-convener of the Critical Studies on Terrorism Working Group. He specializes in applying political theory to dynamics of terrorism and political violence, and vice versa. And his current research interests include terrorism, refugee narrative, iconography of contemporary terrorism, storytelling approaches to inquiring terrorism and political violence, and approaches to counter-terrorism. Finally, my name is Joanna Frey. I'm a senior research fellow at International Center for Policy and Security, and I recently terminated a Marie Curie in security and migration. So it is my pleasure to give the virtual floor to Dr. Charlotte. Oh, Christopher Vallo just arrived. Fantastic. And the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me today. It's a pleasure to be here. My cat has unfortunately joined me, so might make an appearance. Yeah, thank you to Joanna and Christian for organising this event. It's a real pleasure, and apologies for everybody. We didn't know it would be sunny today, so sorry for taking you away from the nice weather. So let me try and share my screen with you. My Teams is always a little bit slow. Is that appearing on your screens for you?
Yes.
Yeah, you got it?
Mm-hmm.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so first of all, I've nicked this title from Jeff Huysmans, who wrote an article, a very good article called Security, What Do You Mean? Quite a few years ago now. But it's such a good title that I couldn't help myself. So there's the acknowledgement to Jeff for that. So what I'll talk about today for roughly 20 minutes is prevention. What do you mean? From the juvenile delinquent to radicalisation prevention. So in general, this is part of a research project that's just started last year, funded by the European Research Council, called Neoliberal Terror, and our website is there, but if you Google it, you'll find it pretty easily, I hope. And the project in general, it looks at the spread and the diffusion of countering violent extremism, CVE, programs around Europe, particularly focusing on the incorporation of health and social care workers into counter-terrorism, especially detecting and reporting radicalisation with duties around that. So how the health and care sectors have been integrated into a security mandate. And also if there is a kind of neoliberal economic association with the diffusion of these CVE programs. So a lot of literature in critical criminology in particular points to neoliberal transitions as a key factor in the individualization and securitization of care. So we're testing that as well. But I won't talk about that kind of quantitative work package today. Instead, I'd like to talk about kind of the theory of prevention, really, and what it means, although it doesn't mean one thing at all. To us, in our current paradigm of the war on terror and the post-war on terror, prevention tends to mean interrupting a future event. We tend to assume it's always meant that. So today, prevention in the EU, but also in nation states, it frames many CT policies, particularly around risky travel patterns, risky financial transactions, and the disruption of online extremist content. So a wide range of things identified in advance that could signify a link to terrorism, but might not. So this is preemption. And after 9/11, this became quite central to the governance of terrorism. It's preemptive, as the name suggests. It tries to disrupt organizations before attacks take place, based on snippets of data. So people's travel records, phrases within online content. Now, to us, this seems very natural, but for most of the 20th century, prevention usually meant something completely different. prevention was instead associated with the post-offence era, around rehabilitation particularly. And this wasn't detecting a crime in advance before it happened. This was trying to prevent a recurrence, usually by modifying and educating the person involved. So we've got two very different meanings of prevention on the table. How does PCVE, I'll probably just call it CVE to be simple, how does this fit in? Well, as you'll all be aware, you can trace the emergence of these programs back to around 2004, 2005, to where they first started to appear in the policy discourse of the Netherlands and the United Kingdom. And these are the first references in parliaments to soft, early intervention measures against terrorism. They weren't entirely public programs at that point, but you can trace the public record back to this time. These policies in their early days, they were heavily reliant upon community integration policy sector, and they problematized terrorism as the result of failed integration, as they sometimes referred to it, of Muslim communities. This was a really heavily racialized discourse in both countries. And there's a lot of research that looks kind of for the origins of where did CVE come from, and they point to obviously these first programs where we first have CVE emerging, but also their continuation of racialized discourse around integration before. But there is something else, and CVE is not just the continuation of community cohesion or integration policy. It also contains something very distinct, especially in its intervention dimension, in that for the first time, recruitment to terrorism began to be reframed at this point as radicalisation for the first time. This happened after some self-starter attacks in Amsterdam and London in the early War on Terror years. And for the first time, terrorism was not framed as a organizational criminal activity which had root causes and social movement theory kind of patterns of analysis, but instead it was reframed by policymakers around the individual and their cognitive and behavioral change and a process that happened to an individual. Now, we've just found this slide that the Portuguese police made in a OSCE document, and as well as being quite funny, it actually encapsulates everything I need to say about the radicalisation discourse. So we got this one person with a nice red functioning heart and without horns on their head, and the radicalisation discourse looks at the stage where this individual goes through a process whereby they grow devil horns and a devil tail, and their heart turns black, and they become evil, I guess. And there's almost a signification of stages in this, and one of them is motivation. Then they seem to be missing one, but you can see here the individual processual kind of diagram of what this epistemology is. Spotting the potentially dangerous citizen before they even know they're dangerous is very novel, and it leads to significant extensions of social control. It's also absolutely fascinating in that it breaks with security logic. Now, what I mean here is, if you've studied securitization theory, and particularly thinking of how threat object and referent object are kept separate, so the object to be protected by security is never the same thing as the threatening object. They are separate, and this is, common to most security discourse. It's not a controversial statement at all. But radicalisation fundamentally upturns that assumption. Radicalisation introduces a becoming, a transition between the referent object, the thing to be protected, and the threat object, the thing that is dangerous to society. And it posits a process, a liminal kind of transition between these stages, where the good thing becomes the bad thing. And this is really novel for security. Importantly, they narrate this as an interruptible process, and that's where CVE can enter and fix the problem. So, if this is so novel, how on earth did it appear? Well, it's novel for security discourse, but it might not be a novel idea elsewhere. So, in the research, we've used a methodology called genealogy. Apologies if you're familiar with it, but it is basically what it says on the tin, the way that you would look through your family history to trace how you became what you are, or who was responsible for passing you some horrible illness genetically. Genealogy is also a kind of political and social research methodology where you look at the archetypal forms of knowledge and how they developed and where they came from. So we used this to look into where did this liminal transition epistemology come into security, given that security has not used this idea before. Instead, it's used the exact opposite of referent object and threat object remaining separate. Well, it comes from crime prevention. It's actually there quite explicitly in the parliamentary statements of both British and Dutch policymakers, who, while they are significantly relying upon integration policy discourse to explain what CVE is and what it will do and how they will protect citizens against terrorism, they also frequently present kind of references to crime prevention and how individualized narratives. Sorry, my cat has jumped on me, so it's distracting me. I'm going to try and pick that sentence up again. There are crime prevention references in these policymakers' statements where they introduce CVE. So, to change slides, here is the slide I'm supposed to be on. Dutch and British ministers are very open about this in the sort of 2004-2005 sessions. Also in 2006, there are a lot of references to this in British Parliament as well. The things I'll pick out for the shortness of time, the Dutch records, Minister of Justice speaks a lot about Operation Jonge, apologies if I'm pronouncing that wrong, which is directed around juvenile delinquency and measures of anti-dropouts to keep young people at risk in school, also proactive citizenship education measures, and talks about how these, in tandem with integration measures, can be extended to prevent terrorism. In Britain, the new Labour discourse of community safety, community policing was heavily integrated in the way that Prevent was built up in the early years, obviously with the racialised framing at the same time, though, this is as an integration policy. And the Channel programme, which is the interventory arm of Prevent, has relied extremely heavily on something called MAPA, which are multi-agency public protection arrangements, which are effectively rehabilitation monitoring arrangements that are multi-agency for criminals considered dangerous. So there's a transfer both of rhetoric and of practice. What I find really interesting about all this are its political consequences, and particularly how it was built up through the discourse of juvenile delinquency. So in the early war on terror, where attacks are happening, hard legal measures against terrorism were failing and being overturned by the courts, these governments reached out to soft prevention, a la juvenile crime prevention. And there's a particular reason why it's juvenile crime prevention and not any other form of crime prevention. As I'll trace through the history in the next slide, it being a discourse applied to the young, you can minimize the political agency of what you're talking about. So reaching out to juvenile crime prevention as the solution that can be transferred to counter-terrorism, it allowed the policymakers to divert from foreign policy grievances that are in martyrdom videos, and to reframe this as sort of youthful misunderstandings. So the Dutch Minister of Justice in the parliamentary record discusses extremist commitment as similar to being a stage of life, as we'd see in juvenile delinquency prevention, and that such expressions are often indistinguishable from expressions that really come from the radical ideology. So there's a crossover here between teenagers getting involved in sort of counterculture movements because they're young and, well, they need steering in the correct direction, and also the prevention of terrorism. This also happens in the New Labour context in the UK, where DCLG, Department of Communities and Local Government, they commission a report on youth programmes as a preemptive, as a model for channeling youth energies in a positive direction. So here we see the benefits of reaching out to youth services and youth protection models, in that you can frame this as, let's just help the youth. They're immature, they can be remolded, and we don't need to take what they're actually saying seriously about foreign policy concerns and the invasion of Iraq, in particular in the British case. So I promised you I'd say something more about juvenile crime prevention and why specifically it's juvenile crime prevention that is so important for the birth of prevention as we see it in CVE. And remember the Portuguese diagram, the image of the good, warm-hearted citizen turning into the black-hearted devil. So where did this kind of liminal idea come from? Well, we've been tracing this back through genealogy a long, long way. I'm going to only take it to the UN today, 1955, but it does go back a long way prior to this. But you don't want to know about the 19th century today. Now, there's a huge importance to the international criminological order that was born after the war. And I, before this research, had never heard of the UN's involvement in crime prevention or the Council of Europe's involvement in crime prevention, but it has been significant and sustained from the 40s onwards in the case of the UN. The UN's been running crime prevention congresses on that basis since then, around prison standards, but also something called social defence, which becomes very key to this story, and juvenile delinquency. So since the 50s, juvenile delinquency has been a central policy area. Effectively, world governments at this time and from this time onwards have been committed to getting together and discussing protecting society as the step beyond punishing the offender. This is how kind of prevention has come into our lexicon since the 50s and has transferred as well to security. That social policy, health, social care, all kinds of economic measures should be used to prevent crime and to protect society from crime. There was a lot of political benefits from this, and it particularly picked up a way to liberalise prevention in the aftermath of the world wars. So preventive policy has been used for many decades before the UN got hold of it, but it was not used in a very liberal way. Instead, it was associated with sort of indefinite detention for dangerous offenders and also not so dangerous offenders. And in the aftermath of the war, the international criminological order was very interested in liberalising prevention and finding a compromise position that didn't involve indefinite detention. So rehabilitation came to the fore from the 50s. And this brought us the very first inklings of the liminal transitional subject that can move not from good to bad, but from bad to good. So at this point, prevention is rehabilitation of offenders, and it develops through the UN from the 50s onwards. It depended very centrally on the figure of the juvenile delinquent, even from 55 onwards, because juveniles are young, and it makes it easier to talk about prevention when your subject has limited criminal responsibility and can be moulded. You don't have to deal with problems like a fixed adult with fixed rights. So you can begin to talk in different language and find a compromised liberal position where you can defend society from crime, have this security logic, protection, while also not completely moving to an illiberal position of indefinite detention, because the subject is moldable and mutable. This developed through the years. There is a paper that goes with this presentation, but it's not ready yet. Importantly, slowly through the decades, this idea of rehabilitation after the offence is moved before the offence. So our old conception of prevention becomes the new, the one we're more familiar with in the current age. Preemption becomes central for those at risk of becoming criminal. My favourite moment in all of this is 1977 in the Council of Europe, where Interpol's, I think it's their research director from the top of my head, speaks at the Committee of Crime Problems and has a wonderful idea for a preventive police force who can, they're not the usual police force, they're a specific force who act only to look out for dangerous individuals going through some kind of crisis, be it a mental health crisis or a drug crisis or drink crisis, and they can detain them before they commit a crime and take them to a social welfare centre to be assisted. Now, this never happened, of course, this never developed, but this is a very senior official at Interpol calling for a preventive police force. And while this has never developed, I mean, I think the closest thing that has ever come to the preventive police force in Farrod's description might be something like Prevent, the anticipatory social policing team that will act before a crime is committed in the interest of defending society. I mean, the rhetoric is quite similar. This didn't actually happen in the 70s, but slowly multi-agency structures were developed across Europe, not as intense as Farrod's idea, but for addicts, dropouts, juveniles, to provide them with social assistance. Now, I'm probably over time, so I'm going to get to the conclusion now and try and draw this all together. So the international organisations, and particularly their criminological bodies, they're almost totally ignored in security studies. But particularly in the case of their post-war efforts to protect society from crime and use preventive social policy, I think they're very important genealogically for the development of counter-terrorism, particularly CVE, and the liminal subjective transition there. Originally, the liminal subject that moved from bad to good, or from good to bad, was a liberal compromise between the authoritarian indefinite detention prevention strategies and the limits of a criminal justice system that responds after the crime. So what can you do if you need a middle ground between indefinite detention because someone is dangerous or only being able to respond after they commit a crime? If you need a middle ground, you have to have the liminal subject that can be rehabilitated or, in contemporary discourse, intervened upon before they commit an offence. But the question, does this compromise still hold? At what point does safeguarding intervention become control in the name of control? At what point does it become repression? Can we ever really have rehabilitation moved before the offence, like it has been in CVE, or as it was imagined in Farrod's preventive police force from the 1977 speech? Can this ever legitimately be done before an offence? So I will stop there and try and come back on the screen. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Charlotte. I will now give between 8-10 minutes to our guests. I will give the floor now to Professor Christopher Weller, because I was afraid he couldn't make it. So I will give him the floor just in case something happens. Then I will give the floor to Sarah. Professor Sarah Leonard, followed by Professor Christian Counters, and finally James, and I will make then other remarks. If anyone is interested in asking any questions and does not want to intervene with video and voice, please leave your questions on the chat box. If not, we will continue as agreed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to be part of this discussion, and I hope you can hear me and perhaps also see me. And now I had some technical troubles, but I think I was able to hear the presentation, and so to thank you very much for these interesting insights. In the end, I wasn't really sure where your argument is going, but I'm sure in the discussion we can look about. But I would like to make some additions out of a special, perhaps a special German discourse about prevention. And first of all, I have to say, and perhaps Christian can add something because he is familiar with both languages. Perhaps in Germany we have a little bit another meaning of the term prevention, in German Prävention, because the German discourse is, in my view, dominated from a differentiation between a first and secondary and a third dimension of prevention. And I'm not sure whether this makes sense to add to your more etymological view about the development of the term. But I think this differentiation helps us, or could help us, to look first of all, as you did it, to the individual and to the process where individuals come to let's say bad motivations to radicalize, and on the other hand the programs of de-radicalization, which have the individual in view. But on the if you look at the secondary form of prevention, it more looks at the system and points to the question: what is the impact of the system which transforms people to radicalize or to de-radicalize? And I would say this is a second dimension where prevention can work and can have an impact. And in Germany we have a great discussion about with which institutions and on which dimensions these forms of prevention can work in view of radicalization. And sorry, can you hear me?
Could you please turn off your mics, please?
Okay, thank you. And the tertiary form of prevention means and works out when the impact of radicalization has already happened, and how to handle the situation and the structures where these individuals will be and how to react on these happenings. And I would say, and this is what I have to add to this discussion, this differentiation between primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention perhaps can help us on the one hand to get a better understanding of radicalization, and on the other hand of de-radicalization. And I only want to make this point, and I'm very interested to hear the other comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Vella. Now, Professor Sarah Lenat, please.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Thank you very much for the paper, Charlotte. I found it really very thought-provoking. So my thoughts were going in the direction of reflecting on the juvenile aspect, because I think that what is quite interesting is that there have been a few cases, and notably in the UK, of very young people, notably very young people joining ISIS, and the juvenile aspect always seems to be forgotten. It seems that once you become involved in terrorist activities, just to simplify matters, it seems that the question of the age is no longer really relevant. And teaching on these subjects, I often have conversations with students about that, and then you see really two camps emerge. There are people who say, well, we should really take into account the juvenile aspect, because when people are young, they do crazy things. They don't fully realize what they are doing. Perhaps they're just looking for an adventure, or they are very vulnerable, and so they are actually really victims. And so we should actually really kind of find understanding, forgiveness, and rehabilitation, and really put a lot of emphasis on support and not really on them being dangerous. And then you'll always find another camp of people saying, well, actually, on the contrary, the fact that you are very young when you become interested in these ideas show how dangerous you are, because, how come that you are, barely a teenager and you already become interested in very radical ideas? So you find that quite, you find really contrasting views, I think, in the way people look at these issues. But it seems to me that in terms of policies, the juvenile aspect tends to be seen in a sense as more probably aggravating than a reason to be understanding and more forgiving and more putting emphasis on rehabilitation and on de-radicalization. So I was wondering what your thoughts are about that, and also how does that sit actually with the legal framework we have to protect the rights of children. And to me, it seems very surprising that actually that aspect tends to be forgotten. And also we tend to deal with young people being involved in these activities as being, as if they're adults already. And we don't really seem to actually look at responsibility, perhaps in terms of their bringing, in terms of the action of their parents. So these people tend to be considered really as adults and fully responsible for their actions. And given the young age of some of them, especially if you take the case of those who went to join the so-called Islamic State, if it happened a few years ago, some of them were really young at the time. And I think it's quite surprising that we're not looking at them as almost, children or teenagers. And there were actually cases outside the UK as well. There was a case a couple of years ago in Belgium where I remember the father of a young man who had decided to travel all the way to Iraq or Syria was saying, well, actually, my son is like a child and the government is responsible and the government should go and rescue him, which obviously did not happen. But I thought that somehow this father had a point. And so I was wondering, what do you make of that kind of, young age of some of these people, the juvenile aspect being forgotten? It seems that once you are a juvenile terrorist, you're just a terrorist. The juvenile aspect seems to be completely ignored. So I was wondering whether you have any thoughts on that, Charlotte. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Christian, the floor is yours.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Charlotte, for the very interesting paper. I very much enjoyed it. I particularly enjoyed your use of the genealogy and going through the different developments. I thought that was very interesting, and I think that was very good to bring our focus onto that. So I thought I'll latch onto that a little bit and kind of try and think of a couple of questions related to that, because on the one hand, you kind of showed how international organizations were quite heavily involved, in fact, from very early on. And I think if we go, like you said, into the 19th century, we might actually find some interesting material there as well, because obviously that's when a lot of the early radicals would have been running around. So I would imagine that there should be some interesting material also there. So on the one hand, we have this very strong development also of international architecture, if you like, in terms of dealing with some of those questions. And then on the other hand, it wasn't until 2001, when the European Union defined terrorism as a crime, that for the first time we had any international organization that even had a definition on terrorism, right? So until then, and even now, I believe the European Union is still the only international organization that has a definition on terrorism. We don't have it at the level of the UN, we don't have it at the level of NATO, we don't have it at any other international organization that provides a definition, because as we all know when we go into the literature and from our own reading of terrorism, it's a very difficult thing to truly define appropriately. So you have this dichotomy where on the one hand there's involvement, but on the other hand there's actually a lot of disagreement about what that is, because I imagine that, you know, that the absence of that is in fact a reflection of a lot of disagreement underlying that in terms of what that essentially is. So I wonder how international organizations, in the absence of disagreeing, in the absence of an agreement of what the actual threat is that they are dealing with, can truly add substantial value. I mean, certainly when it came to the European Union, what we found was that a number of the measures that were taken after 9/11, especially in the area of counter-terrorism financing, we had a number of measures in terms of asset freezing, whether that was against the Taliban, against Al-Qaeda, and so on. They ended up quite quickly at the European Court of Justice on a number of issues. First, the European Parliament put them to the European Court of Justice, and then obviously also individuals had the right to go to the European Court of Justice. And the European Court of Justice on numerous occasions asked the European Union to go back to the drawing board and revamp their measures, even though in fact most of the measures that they were implementing was merely a one-to-one almost carbon copy of the United Nations Security Council, right? Nonetheless, the European Court of Justice said, no, this is an infringement of certain human rights, so we're unable to just accept that, even though this comes from the UN Security Council, and even though some people might make the argument that it's therefore legally binding. The European Union has this European legal order, which in a sense suggests that it is our first priority to look at the rights of European citizens, and even of those that are not European citizens but that are operating in the European legal jurisdiction. And as a result of that, we don't accept this infringement of what we perceive as European rights, later then also as part of the Charter of Fundamental Rights in the European Union, that then also became legally binding with the Lisbon Treaty in 2009. So you have this strong dichotomy, and even courts intervening and saying, well, actually, your program, in a sense, doesn't work. So I wonder what your thoughts are in terms of the role that international organizations can play in this particular. What would be necessary for them to play, if you like, a stronger role? Obviously, a lot of us are saying, okay, international cooperation is important, right? But how can they play that role to facilitate international cooperation, especially when there's disagreement of a fundamental nature? And then finally, I had a question in terms of, you know, the whole agenda in terms of decentering our point of view. I was wondering how you thought the same object would be looked at if we're going outside of the West, if we're looking at it from countries, you know, where the main conflicts are happening. Imagine, let's say, Afghanistan, imagine, let's say, Iraq, let's say Syria, whatever it is that you want to look at. How would we look at some of those issues and also some of those instruments from that point of view? I just wanted to see that as a thought experiment. But I thank you very much for your presentation, and I really enjoyed it. And I think I need to now hand over also so that James has enough time to make some comments as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Christian, and thanks, Charlotte, for that. That was brilliant and very, very thought-provoking. I think by virtue of the fact that I'm going to go last, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to try keep it short, which, you know, is not always guaranteed. Once you start talking, it can go longer. But what I'm interested in a little bit, I want to ask you a little bit, or provoke something different from what my colleagues have said. I think it's more about the future, right? So with regard to your paper and your presentation, you look at these specific kind of parallel logics of pre-crime and pre-security, you could say. And one of the things that came to me while I was listening to your presentation in particular was how much of that can potentially also be applied to COVID-19 as a similar kind of parallel logic of security and kind of pre-risk state. So as the way I see it, when you're talking about, you know, youth kind of delinquency on the one hand, and then you know, CVE on the other, these are kind of parallel logics that at some point begin to cross over and bind. And to me, perhaps there is something in the fact that there is a securitization logic embedded within COVID-19 narratives. We've seen that, and I wonder the degree to which we've taken some of that from a CVE discourse, because you've done work on the past. You know, you talk about the risk of being risky. There's a pre-crime space, a pre-kind of terrorism space. There's also a pre-sickness space now with COVID-19, right? But we have these types of interventions that are specific for it. And the interesting thing about COVID is that normally it kind of flips what you've said, and I think rightly said, around the whole prevention genealogy of the term, because it used to be for a long time in counter-terrorism, it was about treatment rather than prevention. That's normally the way it goes from my limited understanding of pandemics. But we're in this situation now where the ideal of CVE has come to bear through COVID. The vaccines have really come before treatment in many ways. There are some treatment. And so I wonder the degree to which you've spoken about epidemiological interpretations of counter-terrorism, right? And one of the specifics of that is the NHS. And I wonder then, to flip that, how an epidemiological understanding of security, which is surely coming now, I think after all of this, might engage and wrap itself into the CVE space. And what would that look like? And I wonder about that. I mean, maybe I'm just getting too abstract, but I definitely saw some sort of conceptual parallels there. And I think, interestingly, you know, there was a correspondence from the EU counterterrorism coordinator in May of last year, where they were, you know, trying to get prepared for potential risks associated with CVE and COVID-19. So, you know, they talked about chatter of people saying hug a Jew and, wipe if you've been infected, wipe the door handles. I mean, this is coming from an EU official document. So it's interesting that they're already on the lookout for those types of crossovers. So it's a long way of saying it, but if you know what I mean, to flip it, it has been the epidemiological treatment of counterterrorism. You've talked about that before. And I wonder, if you flip that, what's the future of CVE going to look like if those logics do indeed interact quite strongly?
Thank you, James. I also have some questions. I thought your article, your paper was your still working paper is fantastic, and it is inspiring in some way, because it overlaps also with my my previous research to my PhD, where I didn't find the answers, so I went to criminology to look at private security. And what is interesting about this and about genealogy, I was triggered by the word genealogy, and I went back again. And one question that kept popping on my mind was that you go onto the genealogy of radicalization, but you are talking about CVE, and I didn't see you going to the genealogy of extremism. So I think that was quite curious, because then I started digging, And of course, this goes back to 51, and the first time extremism is explicitly named in discourses is when they refer to Martin Luther King as an extremism. So I went back again to Eric's offer, True Believer, and I felt that really matches the idea of what we are trying to convert with counter-violent extremism, that is the desire for change, the desire for substitutes, the misfits that he addresses very well. So this is one of my other questions. Another thing that also popped into my mind, because I really explored the policing and security, and how security was governed when I was doing my research. I'm quite new into terrorism, but I do see CVE as a more social domain rather than a security one, or at least my idea of prevention relates more closely to a social dimension. But what it has been happening, even with the securitization of migration and the securitization speech after, I would say mainly, people refer many times 9/11, but I would say since the attacks in Madrid, in London, it drastically triggered a new set of policy in Europe. Don't you think that crime prevention is more security-like than it should be? And another thing that I also found super interesting is your definition, at risk of becoming risky. And going back to genealogy, I saw more or less a definition in 1817 by Russell, where he addresses the problem of the vulnerability of the adolescent. And this matches with the creation of the Boys Brigade and the Boy Scouts. That was no less than a way to prevent the boys and adolescents, and very clearly between the age of 14 and 18, to engage into activities that would corrupt their vulnerability. And another thing, just to end, I was a little bit, I would say, not shocked, but surprised when you used the social defense theory, because it links to biocriminology and it links to eugenics. And this triggered some questions. Of course, I know where you were going, and you explicitly clarified that in your footnote. But I had one question today, and I had it yesterday, and today I'm Portuguese, and I found it very interesting. But because you used that special cartoon from Portugal, and the thing I don't know, or at least I feel that CVE policies are contained in a bubble, and sometimes they do not look at specific contexts. And by this I mean, does this apply, for example, to what happened with ETA in Spain or IRA in Ireland? Because there were already measures at the judicial level, not to prevent, but to contain, to try to control in these countries. So my question is, aren't we trying to homogenize or to uniformize a CVE politics or CVE policy that is impossible to be homogeneous? And with this, I would give the floor to the questions from our audience. We have Inés Inés Bollanos Soamano. Inés, you can turn on your mic and your camera if you want to ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Well, thanks a lot to the presenter and to all the discussants. It's been very interesting presentation. I look forward to read this in a written form. So I have a question actually linking quite nicely what Professor Pereira was getting at, that I'm quite curious to know what prevention before prevention was. So in my case, I'm Spanish, so I know that there were certain rehabilitation programs specifically intended for terrorist offenders. And so I wonder, on the one hand, just out of curiosity, like if you know what these, because you mentioned doing quite a lot of historical research, if you knew any examples on top of your head, but also as a potentially interesting element of comparison, especially if you know, if you have an argument about liberalization, so then to have maybe one other element to contrast it against. So yeah, thanks a lot.
Charlotte, I will give you now the floor, and then we will go for a second round of questions because you have been bombarded with questions. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. That's probably a good idea because I do have 3 pages worth of questions. And, that can't really continue. Maybe I'll just go in reverse order. Ines, what was prevention before prevention? Okay. So for a while, there have been like disengagement programs, particularly in Scandinavia. I'm more familiar with those examples. Much more kind of traditional 20th century ideas of prevention that occur after conduct deemed problematic has occurred, and to try and normalize the subjects back into an acceptable way of being. So this is much more the kind of 20th century preemption kind of way of understanding prevention. Prevention in that context kind of means preventing recurrence of whatever behavior was problematic, or engagement in a cult or a right-wing circle that was deemed too problematic. So disengagement, has existed for a long time, but usually for people who have come to the attention of the state through their conduct, crossing certain lines, and it hasn't been preemptive in that sense. But that was a very important step in the development of de-radicalization programs in particular, and Torre Bjorgo has written tons on this, very important stuff. He's also one of the authors that has noted the importance of the crime prevention discourse in CVE. Hasn't kind of tracked its crossover from crime to terrorism and how that happened, but has noted it. So lots of references to Torre Bjorgo today. What else is on my list? I'll have to look into that reference to Russell from 1870, because that is definitely very relevant. Okay, I remember you made some points about ETA and the IRA. Well, largely this is the era that many authors have called old terrorism rather than new terrorism, to mark the kind of distinction in how policy dealt with the issue. Not that the groups themselves have really changed in any kind of particular way that's definable, but that this political reaction to them fundamentally shifted, largely from the 90s onwards. So in that particular era, it was much more sort of disruption focused, recruitment focused. So how can a state disrupt recruitment? How can it use law to disrupt an organization's activities? So it's still prevention, but it's the old logic of prevention, if you will, the sort of application of the law to disrupt an organization, rather than a epistemology of an individual kind of transition through cognitive behavioral changes. And it's really with the kind of post 9/11 era that we see that coming through, especially after Madrid. But the Amsterdam attack and the London attack were also very, very central to this. So in a sense, both of those questions were about what did prevention used to be, which is a very good question. James, you turned the question the other way around. Where is prevention going, almost, in the COVID scenario? Yes, I hang around a lot on the kind of Radicalisation Awareness Network, webmails and events, also the Home Office. I'm not on any of the Home Office WhatsApp groups because, you know, why would I be? But we hear about the extension of what they're going to do, countering extremism. And they're, hugely interested, more than we could ever really predict, with the effects of lockdown. So not with COVID itself, but what they're really kind of securitizing is lockdown. And what seems to be the problem for them with their own policies of lockdown is that individuals are isolated from the structures that might keep them safe from extremism. So the structures like, schools, face-to-face healthcare. None of us have seen a doctor for a while, apart from through a screen. So the face-to-face contact with social care and education services that are set up now and securitized by the state as protective counter-extremism measures. So to answer your question, yes, there is a deep link with how security agencies are talking about COVID as an extremism kind of compounder, because it isolates people from the remedy that the state has put in place. Also, I guess very soon we'll see the kind of explicit right-wing anti-lockdown coming in soon. It's probably happening in these working groups now already, but I imagine it will come through pretty soon. I hope that answers the question. Christian. Yeah, so I think in response to Christian's points, I'd want to go back and highlight that while international organizations have worked for a long time on juvenile delinquency and crime prevention, and especially the liminal transition within the same person, this never ever transferred to terrorism until after European states made the link. So it wasn't, when I started the genealogy with, okay, here it is with the Netherlands and here it is with the UK in 2004-ish with the very first references, the crime prevention discourse hadn't moved in the UN to counter-terrorism sort of before that. They were still very much on the traditional track of treating it as an organizational structure that could be disrupted through legal means, not focused on the individual going through a cognitive behavioral transition. So this transition, the person sitting in the room who first had the bright idea of to move crime prevention over to CVE, this happened in Western Europe, and then it spread out through EFUS in particular, who a working kind of network that works with the EU quite a lot. They were very central in the early days as well. But the UN were definitely slow in the uptake, and they followed the lead of sort of Council of Europe and an EU discourse on this. So they were, in the genealogy we're doing, they're always like a year or two behind in terms of some of the rhetoric. It's not really until 2011-ish when the GCTF gets set up that they really start catching up with this new epistemology. So it's a mess, frankly, trying to do a genealogy of all these different IOs at the same time. But slowly, a kind of chronology is starting to appear. And the UN do catch up, and they were definitely in the lead on crime prevention for a long time. But in terms of transitioning the epistemology of one from the other, it didn't happen there until a bit later. Sarah. Oh yeah, this was a really interesting question. Thank you, Sarah. At the same time as kind of, if we look at counter-radicalisation and CVE having this relationship to juvenile crime prevention as a structure and as an epistemology, then why at the same time is youth almost securitized? Particularly, I mean, I'm more familiar with the UK examples, but the UK just never taking anybody back from the refugee camps in Syria, and the particular case of the Bethnal Green teenagers not being treated as teenagers. So this dual use of youth as both central to this protective discourse on one hand over here, but also central to this demonization discourse of, as you said, well, they're young and they did this at such a young age, therefore they must be truly dangerous. Can certainly see that rhetoric in the Home Office, and I can see why you would pick it out. This is why we study this topic. The contradictions in how policymakers talk about things are very interesting. That on the one hand they use a protective social remit, and on the other hand they're happy to condemn people to endless suffering and take away their passports, and yet they could very easily place those same teenagers in the protective discourse, but they don't. I think to answer your question on why that happens, the phrase "cross the Rubicon" comes to mind, that there are certain thresholds in this compromise position, and once somebody crosses the imaginary line that policymakers set up and they say travel to Syria and Iraq, then they seem to be treated differently, and the protective logic no longer seems to be applied to them. Instead, they're treated as fully fledged monsters rather than teenagers who should be helped. And it could be quite simply because there is no perfect answer, and that the protective discourse only gets applied until one point, and once you go over that line, then policymakers apply the security logic, because at the heart of this there is the protective social care element and the security element coming together, and that's never going to be a perfect balance, and they're always going to bump into each other and cause these difficult tensions. And I think you're pointing to the most difficult tension of all. When does a teenager stop being a teenager and have to face the full wrath of the UK Home Office? Well, it seems to be right here. That internal contradiction, there'll be one in every discourse, but I think you put your finger on the most contradicting of all the internal contradictions. And it's just a really good point, so thank you for making it. I'll stop there.
Charlotte, I will only accept 2 more questions because we are far away from the time. So I don't know if it's a she or a he. MC Koenig. It's a she. Hello.
Hi, thanks a lot. My name is Magdalena König. Thanks a lot for this very interesting talk and all the questions and discussions so far. I'm also really looking forward to reading the paper. My question comes from what you said about PCVE going beyond community cohesion policies. And I'm wondering, in my own research, when I see that PCVE policies increasingly touch upon other areas, like non-security related areas, usually like health or human rights, women's rights, children's rights. So organizations you would think they don't want to deal with security. I'm wondering, how would their policies actually really be different if they were just labeled social cohesion? So I'm wondering, what makes it PCVE? Or is it just a label? Or is it the referral mechanism that they introduce obligatorily? So I'm wondering really what do they do actually, you know, as a terms of, is it just a label or is it really different?
Thank you. Charlotte, I will only read two questions that arrived through the forms I sent before, and I think they are quite interesting, so I will read them very quickly. If I understand the nature of your study right, why do you think at the first place neoliberal policies are related with the fusion of counter-radicalization programs across Europe? As you might be well aware, countries such as Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Indonesia also well mimic such programs in some cases to try to be pioneers in these efforts. And the second one, do you feel work could be done on tightening up definitions in order to have greater clarity about the difference between prevention and early identification of harm? At the moment, prevent seems to be a term that describes identifying behaviors and attitudes. The mere fact that these traits are noticeable would indicate that some degree of radicalization has already occurred. By definition, prevent is not a preventive action. At the best, is striving to be an early disruptor. Would it be more accurate definitions help would more accurate definitions help an understanding the phases recruitment be more meaningful and helpful? These are anonymous.
Call it reviewer number 2 then. Okay. I'll start with, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. MC Koenig.
Magdalena.
Magdalena, thank you. That's a really good question. So in the other part of the project, we did the quantitative study of CVE dispersal and implementation. I believe in the end we included 38 countries. So we went beyond the traditional boundaries of Europe. We also included some other states as well, to try and hit the number required for a quantitative study to be relatively rigorous and accurate for the methodology. And yeah, the question of what makes CVE is one we had to think about at great lengths and great extents, because as soon as you move out of a particular, say, even just region of Europe, and you move to a different region of Europe, you find that it's implemented differently. Sometimes in a way that's less objectionable. You know, you move to the Scandinavian nations and you find that there actually is a far greater long-standing tradition of interventory. There goes the cat, I can focus again. So even within Europe, it was very difficult to model. And in the end, we had to go with, I believe it's 3 different dimensions and then multiple questions within each dimension. So one of them was strategy and institutions. So when we were kind of counting how much CVE a country would have, one dimension would be, well, what do they say? You know, what policies do they have? What reviews have they done? What white papers have gone through Parliament? So that was one dimension. And then there was an interventionary dimension. So we kind of mirrored it on the primary, secondary, tertiary kind of public health model. The interventionary kind of model. And then finally, I can't remember what we called the 3rd dimension. I'm sorry. I'm not the quantitative researcher, so I am just overseeing. But it was something so difficult to work out, well, where does social policy end and where does CVE begin? That even EU policy documents, particular ones we ended up quoting when we wrote the study up to say, look, there is no distinct dividing line. It meant multiple points. It is impossible to define on a binary scale whether this is or isn't. It could just be social policy. It could be CVE. Which one is it? So in the end, we had to find a way of making the distinction in order to test what we needed to test. So we just asked. We picked expert respondents from each country, and we sent them a very long survey, and we had to pay them to do it because it was extremely long. And we asked them to kind of grade what is CVE and what isn't in their country, and to what extent they do this measure and not that measure. So in the end, we simply just did our best. It will never be 100%, but we got it as rigorous as we could through an expert survey done by local security officials and academics, and then kind of collated it all together to make a scale. But the definitional question, yeah, I mean, we have to, you can imagine the introduction on this paper, you know, to a quantitative study where we have to explain to a quantitative audience that this is not a simple policy where you can say it is or is not there. Instead, this is a far more nebulous, and sometimes policymakers will use the language that it is CVE, and sometimes they'll want to frame that it's not security at all. It's nothing to do with terrorism. It's actually just cohesion, or it's just integration. And it just really is a very difficult issue. And in the end, all we can honestly say is that, yeah, these discourses have tensions, they have contradictions. If we can't smooth it out, then we have to be honest about how it exists in reality, which is complicated, nebulous, and in tension with itself. So, long answer to a very good question. I caught one of the other questions, which was, you know, why would neoliberalism affect the dispersal of CVE? Why would you think that when countries outside Europe, such as Saudi Arabia, have it? Well, it's not something that I particularly adhere to. It's just a very long-standing argument in criminological and security studies literature, that criminal systems and security systems alter based on their economic structure. So it's the old critical Marxist argument about structure and superstructure. And given that it's so prominent in criminology in particular to link pre-crime to neoliberalism, well, that's why it needed to be tested. So it's not, you know, it's not as simplistic as saying that nowhere without neoliberal economy can have CVE. It's not that kind of a reductionist argument. It's more that neoliberalism altered the way that policy was done, focused it more on the individual level, away from social economic measures, the welfare state model. So this is a long-standing tradition of arguments that is there for decades. We've tested it, and guess what? The association is not there. There is no strong association between neoliberalism and CVE. So it's not something that we're saying is there. Rather, it's actually size of government that correlates with the amount of CVE implementation, which makes sense, right? Because it's expensive. It takes a lot of work. You need specific people employed to promote it and develop the policies. So yeah, the quantitative test shows there's no direct association. But that's under peer review right now, because there are some associations. One thing we found is that the size of Muslim minority populations in all of these 38 countries, we threw it in there as a test, and it turns out it significantly associates with the size of CVE policy, just not something we expected. We actually were trying to test economic policy association with CVE. We threw in some other factors, and the one that's come up statistically significant is sizable Muslim minorities. So there's a securitization dynamic going on there, but it's under peer review now. So it's not, you know, it's not through yet. It's beginning its journey. Also, of course, experience of previous terrorist attacks correlates significantly with amount of CVE, which is not as controversial, and you know, it just makes basic sense. Really, if you've had attacks, you will be looking to implement solutions that other states perhaps have. So it's a policy transfer paper. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you, Charlotte. I think we will close by now because we have been here for 1 hour and and a half, almost. It was a super interesting and thought-provoking presentation. I hope we will be able to receive you anytime soon when you further develop your presentation and your project. We would be very happy. I think I speak for Christian as well. I would like to thank to all the participants, Professor Sarah Leonard, Professor Christopher Veller, Dr. James Fitzgerald, and of course Christian, with whom I have the pleasure to work with. And I will send you the old papers if you wish. Thank you all. This will be available on our YouTube channel anytime soon. So thank you, and keep looking at Euchter's program. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.